The woman sleeping in the narrow bed didn't know she was being watched, and Lysander Othrin had no intention of letting her find out. He stood in the shadows of her small bedroom, his pale fingers gripping the windowsill he'd slipped through moments ago. The apartment was modest, tucked into a weathered building in the older quarter of the city where streetlights flickered and sirens wailed through the night. It was nothing like the marble halls and vaulted ceilings of his own domain, but he came here every night without fail, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. The woman shifted beneath her thin blanket, her dark hair spilling across the pillow. She murmured something in her sleep, and Lysander felt his chest tighten with a sensation he'd forgotten existed. His white hair fell into his eyes as he leaned forward, listening. Then she began to sing. It was barely more than a whisper, a half-conscious melody that drifted through her dreams and out into the quiet room. The words were old, older than this city, older than the countries that had risen and fallen around it. Lysander's breath caught in his throat because he knew this song. His mother had sung it to him 600 years ago, when he was still human, still mortal, still a boy who didn't understand that monsters were real. The woman's voice was nothing like his mother's had been. It was rougher, touched by exhaustion, and the kind of weariness that came from working double shifts at the diner downtown. But the melody was identical, note for haunting note, and it carved through Lysander's ancient heart like a blade made of memory and longing. He shouldn't be here. He was the Vampire King, ruler of the Eastern Courts, commander of bloodlines that stretched back millennia. He had enemies plotting in the shadows, alliances to maintain, a kingdom that required his absolute attention. Yet every night for the past 3 weeks, he'd found himself standing in this cramped bedroom, waiting for this exhausted human woman to sing a lullaby she probably didn't even remember learning. Katherine Pierce worked 6 days a week at a 24-hour diner that smelled like grease and desperation. Lysander had followed her home the first time purely by accident. He'd been hunting in the older districts, searching for the rogue vampire who'd been leaving bodies in alleyways and threatening to expose their kind to the human world. Katherine had walked past him on the street, humming under her breath, and the melody had stopped him cold. He'd abandoned his hunt immediately and trailed her through the dark streets, keeping to the shadows with the ease of centuries of practice. When she'd climbed the stairs to her 3rd-floor apartment, he'd waited on the fire escape, telling himself he just needed to hear the song one more time to be certain, that he'd leave once he confirmed it was the same lullaby his mother had sung. But then Katherine had fallen asleep, and she'd started singing in her dreams, and Lysander had been unable to move. He'd stood frozen on her fire escape until dawn threatened the horizon, forcing him to flee before the sun could burn him to ash. He'd told himself he wouldn't come back, that it was foolish and dangerous and beneath his dignity as king. Yet the next night found him climbing through her window again, and the night after that, and every night since. Katherine's singing faded into soft breathing as she slipped deeper into sleep. Lysander remained where he was, his pale eyes fixed on her peaceful face. In the moonlight filtering through the thin curtains, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders were permanently hunched from carrying heavy trays and working too many hours. She was beautiful in the way humans were beautiful, fragile, and temporary, and burning with a light that would inevitably go out. He was turning to leave when she spoke. "I know you're there." Lysander froze. Katherine's eyes were still closed, her breathing still even. For a moment, he thought she was talking in her sleep. Then her eyes opened, and in the darkness, they found him with unsettling accuracy. "I've known for a week," she said quietly. Her voice was calm. Unnaturally so, for someone who'd just admitted to knowing a stranger had been breaking into her room every night. "You're not very subtle." Lysander considered his options. He could disappear, use his supernatural speed to vanish before she could blink. He could compel her to forget, reach into her mind and erase every memory of his presence. He could kill her, though the thought made something violent and protective rise in his chest. Instead, he stepped into the thin beam of moonlight so she could see him properly. Katherine's breath caught. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her eyes widening as she took in his appearance. His white hair hung past his shoulders, stark against his dark clothes. His skin was pale as marble, and his eyes held the faint crimson glow that all vampires possessed. He was tall and built like a warrior, broad-shouldered and powerful, but he moved with the fluid grace of something that had transcended human limitations centuries ago. "You're not human," Katherine whispered. "No," Lysander agreed. His voice was deep and carried the faint accent of a dozen dead languages. "I'm not. What are you?" He could have lied. Instead, he told her the truth. Vampire. Katherine should have screamed. She should have run or reached for a weapon or done any of the sensible things a human should do when confronted with a predator in her bedroom. Instead, she sat up fully and wrapped her blanket around her shoulders like armor. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Why do you keep coming to my room?" Lysander had asked himself the same question every night. He'd never found a satisfactory answer. Now, standing in front of this strange, fearless woman, he found himself telling another truth he hadn't planned to share. "You sing a song my mother taught me before I was turned," he said. "I come to hear it." Katherine's expression softened. For a long moment, she studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away. No one had looked at him like that in centuries, like he was something other than a monster or a king, like he was simply a person worthy of being seen. "The lullaby?" she asked finally. "Yes, I learned it from my grandmother," Katherine said. "She said it was very old. I didn't realize I was singing it in my sleep. You sing it every night, and you come every night to listen." It wasn't a question, but Lysander nodded anyway. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to name. "You could have asked," Katherine said eventually. "Instead of breaking into my room like a stalker, would you have believed me if I'd knocked on your door and told you I was a vampire who needed to hear your lullaby?" "Probably not," she admitted. A small, unexpected smile tugged at her lips. "This is insane. I should be terrified." "You should be," Lysander agreed. "I could kill you before you could scream, but you won't. How do you know?" Katherine pulled her blanket tighter, her gaze never leaving his. "Because you've been coming here for weeks, and I'm still alive. Because you look at me like I'm something precious instead of something to eat. Because you miss your mother." The last observation hit harder than any weapon could have. Lysander's jaw tightened, and he felt the familiar ache of centuries-old grief rise in his chest. He'd been 17 when he'd been turned, still young enough to remember the warmth of his mother's embrace and the sound of her voice singing him to sleep. The vampire who'd created him had taken everything from him, his humanity, his family, his life, and replaced it with immortality and an insatiable hunger for blood. "I should go," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Wait." Katherine swung her legs out of bed, and Lysander realized she was wearing worn pajama pants and an oversized shirt with a faded logo. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable standing there in her small bedroom, facing down a creature that could tear her apart without effort. "What?" he asked. "Come back tomorrow night," Katherine said. "But use the door this time. I'll leave it unlocked." Lysander stared at her. "You're inviting a vampire into your home? You've already been coming in through the window for weeks. I figure the door is more civilized." Katherine's smile was hesitant but genuine. "Besides, if you wanted to hurt me, you would have done it already. And I'd like to know more about the song, about why it matters to you." Every instinct Lysander possessed told him to refuse, to walk away and never return, to forget about this strange human woman and her impossible kindness. He was a king, and kings didn't form attachments to mortals who would be dust before he'd lived another century. "All right," he heard himself say. "Tomorrow night, I'll use the door." Katherine's smile widened, and Lysander felt something crack in the carefully constructed wall seal he'd built around whatever remained of his heart. He turned and moved to the window, ready to disappear into the night. "Wait!" Katherine called again. "What's your name?" He should have lied, given her a false name, or refused to answer at all. "Lysander," he said instead. "Lysander Othrin. Katherine Pierce," she replied, as if he hadn't already memorized every detail about her. "It's nice to officially meet you, Lysander." Then he was gone, slipping out the window and into the darkness before he could do something foolish like stay until dawn. He ran across rooftops and through empty streets, his supernatural speed carrying him back to the hidden estate where his court resided beneath the city. The mansion was a sprawling complex of old stone and modern security, concealed from human eyes by money and influence, and the kind of ancient magic that predated civilization. His second in command was waiting in the main hall when Lysander arrived. Vladislav was older than Lysander by 2 centuries, a white-haired warrior whose face bore the scars of 1,000 battles. He took one look at his king and shook his head. "You went back to her again," Vladislav said. "It wasn't a question." "Mind your business," Lysander replied, striding past him toward his private chambers. "It is my business when my king is distracted by a human." Vladislav fell into step beside him, his voice pitched low enough that the other vampires in the hall couldn't hear. "The council is asking questions. Dorian is stirring up trouble in the northern courts. We have rogues to hunt and treaties to negotiate, and you're sneaking off every night to watch a mortal sleep. I'm handling it." "Are you?" Vladislav's pale eyes were sharp with concern. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're developing an attachment. You know how that ends, my lord. You've lived long enough to understand that humans are brief and fragile. They die and we endure. That's the nature of what we are. Lysander stopped walking and turned to face his oldest friend. I'm aware of my nature, Vlad. I don't need lectures on the brevity of human life. Then what are you doing? It was a fair question. Lysander didn't have a good answer. She knows what I am, he said finally. I revealed myself tonight. Vladislav's expression darkened. Then you need to either compel her to forget or eliminate her. You can't leave a human with knowledge of our kind running around. It's too dangerous. She's not a threat. Every human with knowledge of us is a threat. It's basic security, Lysander. You wrote half those protocols yourself. I'm not compelling her, and I'm sure as hell not killing her. Lysander's voice dropped into a tone that had sent lesser vampires fleeing in terror. This discussion is over. He strode away before Vladislav could argue further, leaving his second-in-command standing in the hallway with a worried expression. Lysander's chambers were at the top of the mansion, a suite of rooms that had been decorated with the spoils of 6 centuries of existence. Priceless artwork hung on the walls. Antique furniture filled the spaces. Books in a dozen dead languages lined the shelves. None of it mattered. None of it had mattered in a very long time. Lysander stood at the window, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue as dawn approached. In a few hours, he'd be forced into the death-like sleep that claimed all vampires during daylight hours. Then night would fall again, and he'd have to decide whether to honor his promise to Katherine. The smart thing would be to stay away. To let her believe he'd changed his mind, to let the strange connection between them wither before it could grow into something dangerous. But Lysander hadn't become king by always doing the smart thing. And the memory of Katherine's fearless eyes and gentle smile made him want to do something he hadn't done in centuries. He wanted to take a risk. The next night, Lysander stood outside Katherine's apartment building and stared at the main entrance like it was a portal to another dimension. He'd faced down armies and ancient vampires, had negotiated with beings that predated human civilization, had survived plots and assassinations and wars that had reshaped the supernatural world, yet knocking on a human woman's door felt more dangerous than all of it. He'd dressed carefully, trading his usual dark combat gear for clothes that wouldn't look out of place in the mortal world: black jeans, a dark shirt, a long coat that concealed the weapons he carried out of habit. His white hair was pulled back, and he'd made sure his eyes held no trace of their crimson glow. The door to the building was unlocked, as doors in this neighborhood often were. Lysander climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, his enhanced hearing picking up the sounds of life behind each door. Televisions and arguments, crying children and barking dogs, the full symphony of human existence. Katherine's apartment was at the end of the hall. Lysander stood in front of her door for a long moment, gathering himself. Then he knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and Katherine stood there in the same worn clothes she'd been wearing the night before. Up close, in the harsh light of her apartment, Lysander could see details he'd missed in the darkness: the spattering of freckles across her nose, the small scar on her chin, the way her dark eyes were flecked with gold. "You came," she said, and there was relief in her voice that made Lysander's chest tighten. "You left the door unlocked," he replied. "That was foolish. I knew you'd come." Katherine stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Besides, I figure the Vampire King can protect me from regular burglars." Lysander froze halfway through the doorway. "How did you know I was a king?" "Lucky guess." Katherine closed the door behind him. "You carry yourself like royalty, all commanding and expecting people to obey you. Plus, you have that whole ancient, powerful, dangerous thing going on. I figured you weren't just some random vampire. You figured correctly." Lysander looked around her apartment properly for the first time. It was small, dominated by a kitchenette and a lumpy couch that had seen better decades. A narrow doorway led to the bedroom where he'd spent so many nights watching her sleep. Everything was clean but shabby, the kind of place someone lived when they worked hard but never quite earned enough. "It's not much," Katherine said, following his gaze. She sounded defensive. "But it's mine." "It's fine," Lysander said, and meant it. He'd lived in castles and palaces, but he'd also spent decades in ruins and caves and places far worse than this modest apartment. Luxury had stopped meaning anything to him centuries ago. Katherine moved to the kitchenette and gestured to the ancient coffee maker on the counter. "I can't offer you coffee, I guess. Do vampires drink coffee?" "We can, though it does nothing for us." "Right. Blood only?" "Yes. When did you last feed?" Katherine asked the question as casually as if she were asking about the weather. Lysander studied her carefully. trying to understand this strange human who invited vampires into her home and asked about their feeding habits without a tremor of fear. 2 nights ago, I hunt criminals and those who prey on the innocent. I don't kill innocents. That's good to know. Katherine poured herself a cup of coffee, and Lysander could smell the cheap grounds and the exhaustion in her movements. Do you want to sit, or do vampires not sit? We sit. Lysander lowered himself onto the couch, which protested with an ominous creak. Katherine curled up in the corner opposite him, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug, like it was a source of warmth in a cold world. So, she said, tell me about the song. Lysander had known this question was coming. He'd spent the day sleeping and the evening preparing himself for it. Yet now that Katherine was looking at him with those impossibly kind eyes, he found the words harder to access than he'd anticipated. I was born in 1423, he began. In a village that doesn't exist anymore, in a country that's been carved up and renamed a dozen times since. My mother was a weaver, and my father worked the land. We were poor but happy. The memories were distant, softened by centuries, but still painful. My mother sang that lullaby to me every night before bed. She said her mother had taught it to her, and her mother before that. It was supposed to protect children from evil spirits. Didn't work very well, Katherine said softly. No. Lysander's jaw tightened. When I was 17, a vampire attacked our village. He was old and powerful and completely mad. He slaughtered most of the population and turned a handful of us for his amusement. My family died that night. I watched them burn our house with my mother still inside. Katherine's hand flew to her mouth. Lysander, I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less. Lysander looked at her sharply. Most people offered platitudes about time healing wounds or tried to change the subject when confronted with that kind of ancient grief. Katherine simply acknowledged it, and somehow that was more comforting than 6 centuries of people telling him to move on. The vampire who turned me kept me as a pet for 5 years, Lysander continued. He didn't know why he was telling her this. He never talked about those years, not even with Vladislav. He taught me to hunt and kill, taught me that humans were nothing but food. He tried to make me into a monster like himself. What happened to him? I killed him. Lysander's voice held no remorse. I grew stronger than he'd anticipated, learned everything he had to teach, and then I tore out his throat and burned his body. After that, I started building my own territory, made alliances with other vampires who wanted structure instead of chaos. Eventually, I united the Eastern courts under my rule. How long ago was that? 300 years, give or take. Katherine was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would shatter most humans' understanding of the world. That's a long time to be alone, she said finally. I'm not alone. I have my court. My warriors, that's not the same as having someone who knows you. Katherine set down her coffee mug and leaned forward. You have subjects and soldiers, but do you have friends? Family? Anyone you can be yourself with? The question cut deeper than Lysander wanted to admit. Vladislav is my friend. He's been with me for centuries. But you don't talk to him about your mother or the lullaby. No. Why not? Because showing weakness was dangerous when you were king. Because vulnerability could be exploited by enemies and rivals. Because he'd learned centuries ago that caring about things only led to pain when those things inevitably died or betrayed you. Because I don't, Lysander said instead. Why did you invite me here, Katherine? You should be afraid of me. You should have run the moment you realized what I was. Katherine pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself smaller on the couch. For a moment, Lysander thought he'd pushed too hard, that she'd finally realized the danger she'd invited into her home. Then she smiled, and it was the saddest smile he'd ever seen. I'm tired of being afraid, she said quietly. I've spent my whole life afraid. Afraid of not having enough money for rent. Afraid of getting sick and not being able to afford a doctor. Afraid of ending up alone with no one who cares if I live or die. Then this impossibly dangerous, powerful vampire starts sneaking into my room every night, and instead of killing me, he just stands there listening to me sing. It's the strangest, most bizarre thing that's ever happened to me, and somehow it makes me feel less alone than I've felt in years. Lysander's carefully constructed emotional walls cracked a little wider. That's foolish. Probably, Katherine agreed, but I don't care. Tell me more about your mother. What was her name? Alina. That's beautiful. What was she like? No one had asked Lysander about his mother in 600 years. He found himself talking, words spilling out that he'd kept locked away for centuries. He told Katherine about Elena's quick laugh and clever hands, about the way she'd made their small home feel warm and safe despite their poverty. He told her about the stories his mother had told, about the songs she'd sung, about the way she defended her children against anyone who threatened them. Katherine listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finally fell silent, she reached across the couch and did something no one had dared do in centuries. She took his hand. Lysander stared down at her small, warm hand wrapped around his cold, pale fingers. He should pull away. Touch was dangerous, led to attachments and complications he couldn't afford. But Katherine's hand was soft and alive, and he'd been cold for so long. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I can tell you a story about my grandmother if you want, the one who taught me the lullaby. I'd like that." So Katherine talked, her voice soft and musical in the quiet apartment. She told him about a woman who'd raised her after her parents died, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them fed and housed, who'd sung old songs and told older stories. Her grandmother had died 5 years ago, and Katherine had been alone since then, working herself to exhaustion just to survive in a city that didn't care whether she lived or died. "I'm sorry," Lysander said when she finished. "For your loss." "Thank you." Katherine squeezed his hand gently. "It's strange, isn't it? We're both orphans, in a way, 6 centuries apart, but the same kind of alone." "Yes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still clasped across the worn couch. Outside, the city rumbled and roared, oblivious to the vampire and the human forming an impossible connection. Finally, Lysander reluctantly pulled his hand away. "I should go," he said. "Dawn isn't far off. Will you come back?" Katherine asked. There was no artifice in the question, just honest hope. "Do you want me to?" "Yes." Lysander stood, and Katherine walked him to the door. In the narrow hallway, they were closer than they'd been all night, and Lysander could hear her heartbeat accelerating, could smell the unique scent of her blood beneath her skin. She should smell like prey. Instead, she smelled like home. "Tomorrow night," he said, "if you're sure." "I'm sure." Lysander left before he could do something foolish like kiss her. He returned to his mansion as dawn painted the sky gray, slipping into his chambers just as the deadly sunlight began to creep across the city. As he surrendered to the death sleep that claimed all vampires during the day, his last thought was of Katherine's hand in his, warm and alive and impossibly brave. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every night, Lysander would knock on Katherine's door, and she would let him in. They would talk for hours, sharing stories and silences, building a friendship that defied every rule of vampire society. Katherine told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher before student loans and life had crushed that ambition. Lysander told her about the politics of vampire courts, the delicate balance of power that kept their kind hidden from humanity. "Don't you ever want to just tell humans we exist?" Katherine asked one night. She was curled up in her usual corner of the couch, wearing pajamas with cartoon cats on them that made Lysander's ancient heart clench with unexpected affection. "No," he said firmly. "Humans outnumber us thousands to 1. If they knew we existed, they'd hunt us to extinction. We survive by staying in the shadows. But don't you get tired of hiding? Survival matters more than pride." Katherine was quiet for a moment, then said something that shocked him. "I told my boss I was seeing someone. She didn't believe me at first, because I never date. But I insisted." Lysander's whole body went still. "Why would you tell her that?" "Because I am seeing someone. You." Katherine's eyes met his, steady and sure. "I know we're not dating in the traditional sense, but you're the only person I talk to these days. The only one I look forward to seeing. That counts for something, doesn't it?" It counted for more than Lysander wanted to admit. Over the past 2 weeks, these quiet hours in Katherine's shabby apartment had become the center of his existence. He found himself rushing through court business and delegating responsibilities he'd never trusted to others, all so he could knock on Katherine's door a few minutes earlier each night. "Katherine," he said carefully, "you understand this can't go anywhere. I'm a vampire. You're human. The differences between us are pretty obvious," Katherine interrupted. "You drink blood. You can't go out in sunlight. You're 600 years old, and you're royalty in a secret supernatural society. I work at a diner and have $17 in my checking account. Trust me, I'm aware of the differences. Then you understand why we need to be careful. What I understand is that you're making excuses because you're scared." Katherine leaned forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made Lysander's breath catch. "You're scared of caring about someone who's going to die eventually. You're scared of letting someone see the parts of you that aren't the big, scary vampire king. You're scared that if you let yourself feel something real, it might hurt. I'm 600 years old. I'm not scared of anything." Liar. The word hung between them, and Lysander couldn't deny it. She was right. He was terrified of the way his dead heart seemed to beat when Katherine smiled. Terrified of how much he wanted to stay in this cramped apartment instead of returning to his mansion and his court. terrified of what it would feel like when Katherine inevitably aged and died while he remained unchanged. Even if I wasn't scared. Lysander said slowly, there are practical concerns. My position comes with enemies. The vampire who's been leaving bodies in alleys is still out there, and he's not the only threat I'm dealing with. If anyone knew I cared about you, you'd become a target. So protect me. Katherine said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. You're the vampire king. Protecting people is literally in your job description, isn't it? It's not that simple. Why not? Katherine stood up, crossing the small space between them until she was standing directly in front of where Lysander sat on the couch. I'm not asking you to marry me or turn me into a vampire or anything crazy. I'm just asking you to admit that this thing between us is real, that it matters. Lysander looked up at her, this brave, foolish human who'd somehow seen past 6 centuries of carefully constructed armor to the lonely boy still mourning his mother. He should compel her to forget him. He should walk away and never come back. He should do any number of sensible things that would keep them both safe. Instead, he reached out and pulled her down onto his lap. Katherine made a small sound of surprise as she settled against his chest, her heart hammering so hard he could feel it against his ribs. Lysander wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the diner grease that clung to her clothes. It matters, he said quietly into her hair. You matter, more than is safe or wise or sensible. Katherine's arms came up around his neck and she buried her face in his shoulder. Thank God. I was starting to think I was crazy for falling for a vampire. You are crazy. But Lysander's voice was gentle and his arms tightened around her protectively. Anyone with sense would have run screaming the first night. Good thing I've never had much sense. Katherine pulled back enough to look at him, and Lysander saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. Fear and hope and the kind of desperate longing that came from being alone too long. What do we do now? I don't know, Lysander admitted. I haven't felt like this in over 500 years. That's kind of terrifying and kind of romantic at the same time. Welcome to my existence. Katherine laughed, and the sound filled the apartment with warmth. Then her expression grew serious. You said you have enemies. Tell me about them. I should know what I'm getting into. So Lysander told her about the rogue vampire who'd been killing humans, about the northern courts who wanted to challenge his rule, about the ancient protocols and blood laws that governed vampire society. He told her about Dorian, a vampire lord who'd been consolidating power in the north and making noise about how the eastern courts needed younger, more aggressive leadership. He sounds like a problem, Katherine said. He is, but I've dealt with worse. Lysander ran his hand through Katherine's dark hair, marveling at how soft it was. The rogue is a more immediate concern. He's young and reckless, and he's going to expose us all if he keeps leaving bodies in obvious places. Have you gotten close to finding him? Vladislav has been tracking him. We think he has a lair somewhere in the industrial district. Lysander's jaw tightened. When we find him, I'll handle it personally. Katherine was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing idle patterns on Lysander's shoulder. Can I ask you something? Yes? Have you ever turned anyone? Made another vampire? The question made Lysander tense. Only once, and it was a mistake. His name was Sebastian, and I turned him to save his life after a rival attacked him. He went mad from the transformation and became the kind of monster I'd spent centuries trying to eliminate. I had to put him down myself. I'm sorry. It taught me an important lesson. Turning someone isn't salvation. It's a curse, and I won't inflict it on anyone else. Lysander looked at Katherine intently. I'm telling you this so you understand. I care about you, but I will never turn you. When your time comes, I'll have to let you go. Katherine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm not asking you to turn me. I just wanted to know if it was an option. It's not. Okay. She leaned her forehead against his. Then we'll figure something else out. Make the most of whatever time we have. That's all any mortal can do. You say that like you're not part mortal anymore. But you are, Lysander. You're still the boy who loved his mother and mourned his family. Being a vampire didn't erase that part of you. Lysander closed his eyes, overwhelmed by how clearly Katherine saw him. You're too perceptive for your own good, one of my many flaws. Katherine kissed his cheek, quick and gentle. You should probably go. The sun will be up soon. She was right. Lysander could already feel the approaching dawn, the way his body grew heavier as sunlight crept closer. He stood, carefully settling Katherine on her feet, reluctant to let her go. Tomorrow night? She asked. Always. Lysander cupped her face in his cold hands. Lock the door behind me. And Katherine, be careful. If anyone approaches you asking about me or vampires, don't engage. Come straight home and wait for me. You're starting to sound paranoid. I'm starting to sound realistic. Promise me. Katherine rolled her eyes but nodded. I promise. Now go before you turn into a crispy vampire. Lysander left, but the worry stayed with him through the day. That evening, he summoned Vladislav to his chambers before heading to Catherine's apartment. I need you to assign someone to watch over a human, Lysander said without preamble. Vladislav's eyebrows rose. The woman from the apartment? Yes, discreetly. She's not to know she's being watched, but I want someone on her at all times when I'm not there. My lord, with respect, this is getting dangerous. You're assigning resources to protect a human. The council is going to start asking questions. Let them ask. Lysander's tone brooked no argument. Katherine is under my protection now. Anyone who touches her answers to me personally. Make sure that message gets distributed throughout the courts. Vladislav looked like he wanted to argue further, but centuries of service had taught him when his king's mind was made up. As you command, I'll assign Victor to daytime surveillance. He's young but reliable. Thank you. Lysander moved toward the door, then paused. And Vlad, have we made any progress on finding the rogue? Actually, yes. We tracked him to an abandoned factory near the river. I was planning to lead a team there tomorrow night. I'll come with you. We end this threat before he causes any more damage. Lysander's eyes glowed crimson in the dim light, and before he draws human attention to our kind. An hour later, Lysander was knocking on Catherine's door. She answered immediately, and he could smell fresh paint and cleaning solution. What did you do? He asked, stepping inside. Katherine looked sheepish. I painted the bedroom. Used some of my tips to buy paint from the hardware store. I figured if you're going to keep visiting, I should make the place look less depressing. Lysander looked around the small apartment and noticed other changes. New curtains on the windows, a throw blanket on the couch that hadn't been there before. Small touches that made the space feel more like a home. You didn't have to do that, he said softly. I wanted to. Katherine closed the door and locked it carefully, remembering his warning from the night before. Besides, it made me feel better. Like I was doing something productive with my day off instead of just sleeping. When was the last time you had a full day off? Katherine had to think about it. 6 weeks ago. The diner is always short-staffed, and I need the money. An idea formed in Lysander's mind. It was impulsive and probably foolish, but Catherine's exhausted face and worn clothes made something protective and possessive rise in his chest. What if you didn't have to work at the diner anymore? Katherine froze in the process of reaching for her coffee. What? I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Let me help you. Lysander, no. Catherine's voice was firm. I'm not going to be some kept woman. I work for what I have. I'm not suggesting you become dependent on me. I'm suggesting I help ease the burden so you're not working yourself to death. Lysander moved closer, careful not to crowd her. You're exhausted all the time. You have dreams you've abandoned because you're too busy surviving. Let me give you the space to breathe. Why? Catherine's eyes were suspicious. What do you get out of this? Time with you. The answer came without thought. More time where you're not falling asleep in the middle of conversations because you worked a double shift. Time where you can pursue the things that matter to you instead of just surviving day to day. Katherine bit her lip, clearly torn. It feels like charity. It's not charity. It's what people who care about each other do. They help. Lysander reached out and took her hand. Please, let me do this. I don't want to owe you. You don't. There are no strings attached. If tomorrow you decide you never want to see me again, the support continues. I just want to know you're taken care of. Katherine was quiet for a long time, searching his face for something. Finally, she nodded. Okay, but I'm paying you back eventually. Somehow, if it makes you feel better to think so. Lysander couldn't keep the relief out of his voice. The thought of Katherine exhausting herself at that terrible diner had been bothering him more than he wanted to admit. Give your notice tomorrow. I'll have funds transferred to your account by the end of the week. How much are we talking about here? Lysander named a figure that made Catherine's eyes go wide. That's enough to live on for a year, longer if you're careful. Use it to go back to school if you want, or don't. Just stop working yourself into the ground. Katherine threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug. Thank you. You have no idea what this means, but Lysander did know. He remembered being powerless and poor, remembered watching his mother work herself to exhaustion. If he could spare Katherine that struggle, he would, regardless of whether their strange relationship lasted. They spent the rest of the night talking about Catherine's dreams. She wanted to become a teacher, to work with children in underfunded schools who needed someone to believe in them. Lysander found himself making mental notes, already planning how he could help make those dreams reality without Katherine knowing he was pulling strings. When he left at dawn, he felt lighter than he had in decades. Katherine was safe, she was cared for, and she was his in a way that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with connection. The next night, Lysander went with Vladislav and a team of his best warriors to hunt the rogue vampire. The abandoned factory was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed catwalks, the perfect lair for a vampire who wanted to hide from both human and supernatural eyes. They found him in a makeshift nest in the basement, surrounded by the bones of his victims. The rogue was young, maybe 30 years turned, with the wild eyes of someone who'd given in completely to bloodlust. When he saw Lysander, he actually laughed. "The king himself," the rogue said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Come to lecture me about discretion." "I've come to pass judgment," Lysander replied coldly. "You've violated every law of our kind. You've killed recklessly, left evidence, and drawn human attention to our existence. The sentence is death. Your laws are chains." The rogue moved with supernatural speed, launching himself at Lysander. "We're apex predators. We should rule humans, not hide from them." The fight was brief and brutal. The rogue was fast and strong, but Lysander had centuries of experience and the kind of power that came from ancient blood. Within minutes, he had the rogue pinned against a concrete wall, his hand wrapped around the younger vampire's throat. "We hide because we're outnumbered," Lysander said quietly. "Because humans are fragile and frightened things with numbers are dangerous. You would have learned that if you'd lived long enough." He ripped the rogue's head from his shoulders before the vampire could respond. The body crumbled to ash, and Lysander let the remains fall through his fingers. "Clean this up," he ordered his warriors. "Make sure there's no trace we were here, and find whoever turned this idiot. They're responsible for teaching their progeny our laws." Vladislav supervised the cleanup while Lysander stood in the shadows, thinking about Katherine. If the rogue had found her, if he'd decided to target the Vampire King's human, the thought made cold rage pool in Lysander's chest. He'd killed to protect his territory and his laws tonight, but he realized he would burn down the entire city to protect Katherine. The intensity of the feeling should have frightened him. Instead, it felt right, like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for centuries. When the factory was clean and the evidence destroyed, Lysander returned to Katherine's apartment. She was still awake despite the late hour, curled up on her couch with a stack of teaching certification books she must have ordered online. "You're back early," she said, smiling when he knocked, and she let him in. Then her smile faded as she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" "I killed someone tonight." Lysander said it bluntly, watching for her reaction. "The rogue I told you about. He wouldn't surrender, so I executed him." Katherine set down her book slowly. "Are you okay?" The question surprised him. Most people would focus on the death, on the violence. Katherine was asking about him. "I'm fine. It needed to be done. That doesn't mean it's easy." Katherine stood and crossed to him, taking his cold hands in her warm ones. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No. I want to forget about it." Lysander pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "Tell me about your books. Tell me about becoming a teacher." So Katherine talked, and Lysander listened, letting her warm voice chase away the memories of violence and ash. Later, as he held her on the couch, he realized that this was what he'd been missing for 6 centuries. Not just companionship, but someone who saw past the crown and the power to the person beneath. Someone who asked if he was okay instead of just fearing what he could do. "I'm falling in love with you," Katherine said suddenly, the words barely a whisper against his chest. "I know I probably shouldn't say it, and I know it complicates everything, but it's true." Lysander's arms tightened around her. He should tell her this was a mistake. That love between a vampire and a human led only to heartbreak. That he couldn't give her the future she deserved. "I love you too," he said instead. "And you're right. It complicates everything." Katherine tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes shining. "I don't care, do you?" "No?" And he didn't. For the first time in centuries, Lysander was willing to embrace complication and risk and all the messy emotions he'd spent so long avoiding. "But we need to be smart about this. My world is dangerous, and anyone who knows about you could use you against me. So we're careful. We don't tell anyone. Vladislav knows. He's been watching over you during the day." Katherine's eyes widened. "Someone's been following me?" "Protecting you," Lysander corrected. "There's a difference. You should have asked me first." "You're right. I'm sorry." Lysander cupped her face gently. "But I can't stop worrying about you when I'm asleep and vulnerable during the day. Let Victor continue watching over you. Please." Katherine sighed but nodded. "Fine, but he better be discreet. The last thing I need is people thinking I have a stalker. Victor is very good at his job. You'll never know he's there. They fell into a new routine after that. Katherine quit the diner, despite her manager's protests, and enrolled in online classes to finish her teaching certification. During the day, while Lysander slept the death sleep in his mansion, Victor watched over her from the shadows. At night, Lysander would come to her apartment, and they would talk and laugh and slowly build something that looked like a relationship against all logic and reason. A month passed. Then 2. Katherine flourished without the constant exhaustion of working double shifts. Color returned to her cheeks, and the dark circles under her eyes faded. She threw herself into her studies with the kind of passionate intensity that made Lysander's ancient heart ache with fondness. For his part, Lysander found himself changing in small ways. He delegated more responsibilities to Vladislav and his other trusted advisors, spending less time on vampire politics and more time in Katherine's small apartment. He brought her books and flowers and once, on impulse, a ridiculously expensive necklace that she refused to accept until he convinced her it was a family heirloom that deserved to be worn by someone who would appreciate it. "You're spoiling me," Katherine said one night, looking at the fresh bouquet of roses he'd brought. "I'm treating you the way you deserve to be treated," Lysander corrected. He was sitting at her small kitchen table, watching her make dinner. He couldn't eat human food, but he loved watching her cook. Loved the domesticity of it all. "My friends at the diner think I'm dating some rich businessman," Katherine said, stirring pasta with a wooden spoon. "They keep asking to meet you. What do you tell them? That you're very private and very busy." Katherine smiled over her shoulder. "They think I'm making you up, that you're too good to be true. They're half right." Lysander stood and moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm not good at all. I'm a monster who's lived 600 years by doing terrible things. You're a person who's survived 600 years, Katherine corrected, leaning back against his chest. "There's a difference, is there?" "Yes." She turned in his arms to face him. "Monsters don't sit in shabby apartments listening to humans ramble about teaching certifications. Monsters don't bring flowers or worry about whether their girlfriend is getting enough sleep. You're not a monster, Lysander. You're just someone who's been alone too long." Lysander kissed her then, unable to resist the pull any longer. Katherine's lips were warm and soft, and she tasted like the pasta sauce she'd been cooking. The kiss started gentle but deepened quickly, 600 years of loneliness and longing pouring through Lysander like a dam breaking. When they finally pulled apart, Katherine was breathless and flushed. "We should have done that sooner," she said. "I was trying to be honorable," Lysander replied, his voice rough. "Stop trying so hard." Katherine pulled him down for another kiss. They moved to the bedroom after dinner, and Lysander spent hours mapping Katherine's body with reverent attention. He was careful with his strength, terrified of hurting her, but Katherine wasn't fragile in the ways he'd feared. She met him with equal passion, her human warmth chasing away centuries of cold. Afterward, as Katherine fell asleep in his arms, Lysander felt something close to contentment. He knew it couldn't last. Nothing good in his life ever lasted. But for now, holding the woman he loved while she sang softly in her dreams, he let himself believe that maybe this time would be different. The illusion shattered 3 weeks later when Vladislav burst into Katherine's apartment just after sunset, his face grim. "My lord, we have a problem," Vladislav said without preamble. "Dorian knows about the woman." Lysander was on his feet instantly, every protective instinct screaming danger. "How?" "One of the northern court vampires saw you entering the building. They reported back to Dorian, and he's been having Katherine investigated." Vladislav's expression was troubled. "He's planning to use her against you. Explain." Lysander's voice was dangerously quiet. Katherine had woken up at the commotion and was pulling on a robe, her eyes wide. "What's going on?" "Dorian is challenging your rule," Vladislav said. "He's been gathering support in the northern courts, claiming you've grown weak. Now he has evidence that the Vampire King is in love with a human. He's using it to say, you've lost sight of what's important. That's ridiculous," Katherine said. "How does loving someone make you weak?" "In vampire society, attachments are vulnerabilities," Vladislav explained, "especially attachments to mortals. Dorian is arguing that Lysander is compromised, that he'll make decisions based on protecting you rather than what's best for vampire kind. He's not entirely wrong," Lysander said grimly. He turned to Katherine. "I need you to leave the city, tonight. I'll arrange protection and set you up somewhere Dorian can't find you." "Absolutely not." Katherine's chin lifted stubbornly. "I'm not running away. Katherine, this isn't negotiable. Dorian will kill you to hurt me. Then maybe you should kill him first." She said it calmly, like she was suggesting he pick up groceries. Lysander stared at her. I can't just murder a vampire lord without cause. There are laws, protocols. If I kill him without proper justification, the other courts will turn against me. Even if he's threatening me, you're human. By vampire law, you're not significant enough to justify killing a lord. Lysander's jaw clenched at the ugly truth. I've tried to change those laws, but centuries of tradition don't shift quickly. Katherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders and looked Lysander directly in the eyes. What if we turn his plan against him? What do you mean? Vladislav asked. Dorian thinks loving me makes Lysander weak. What if we prove the opposite? What if we show that Lysander is strong enough to protect what he cares about? Katherine's eyes were bright with determination. Use me as bait. Let Dorian make his move. And then you'll have justification to eliminate him. Absolutely not, Lysander said immediately. I'm not using you as bait. The risk is too high. The risk is already high, Katherine pointed out. Dorian knows about me. Running away just delays the inevitable. But if we control the situation, we have a better chance of surviving it. Vladislav was looking at Katherine with newfound respect. She's not wrong, my lord. If we stage a controlled confrontation, we can eliminate Dorian with cause and send a message to anyone else thinking of challenging you. No, Lysander's voice was flat. I won't risk her life. You won't have to. Katherine moved to stand in front of him, taking his cold hands in her warm ones. I trust you to protect me, and I trust that you're strong enough to kill anyone who threatens us. But we can't run forever. Eventually, you need to deal with Dorian. Every instinct Lysander possessed screamed at him to refuse, to lock Katherine somewhere safe and deal with Dorian himself. But he'd lived 600 years by being pragmatic, and he could see the logic in Katherine's plan. Dorian was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Using Katherine as bait was dangerous, but it would draw Dorian out into the open where Lysander could strike with justification. If we do this, we do it my way, Lysander said finally. You don't take any unnecessary risks. The moment I say run, you run. Understood? Katherine nodded. Understood. Vlad, gather our most trusted warriors. I want them positioned around the building at all times. If Dorian makes a move, I want to know about it instantly. Lysander's eyes glowed crimson with barely contained fury. And send word to the other courts. Let them know that any vampire who touches Katherine Pierce answers to me personally. Make sure the message is clear, as you command. Vladislav bowed and left to carry out his orders. Once they were alone, Katherine wrapped her arms around Lysander. I'm not going to die, she said softly. You won't let that happen. No, I won't. Lysander held her close, breathing in her scent. But if anything happens to you because of me, then we'll deal with it together. Katherine pulled back enough to look at him. I love you, Lysander. That means I'm in this for the long haul, danger and all. You don't get to protect me from your world when your world is part of who you are. Lysander kissed her forehead gently. You're too brave for your own good. I learned from the best. They spent the next 3 days preparing for Dorian's inevitable move. Vladislav positioned warriors throughout the neighborhood, hidden from human eyes but ready to respond at a moment's notice. Lysander barely left Katherine's side, his protective instincts in overdrive. He taught her basic self-defense, showed her where to strike a vampire to cause maximum damage, made her memorize escape routes from every room in her apartment. Katherine bore it all with patient determination, understanding that Lysander's overprotectiveness came from fear rather than doubt in her abilities. At night, she held him close and sang the lullaby that had brought them together, her voice soft and soothing in the darkness. Dorian made his move on the 4th night. Lysander was with Katherine in her apartment when he felt the disturbance, the psychic pressure of multiple powerful vampires approaching. He was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Katherine and the door. Stay behind me, he ordered. The door exploded inward, and 3 vampires entered the apartment. They were all ancient by vampire standards, their white hair and crimson eyes marking them as powerful members of Dorian's court. Behind them, moving with the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won, came Dorian himself. Dorian was tall and imposing, his white hair pulled back in a severe style that emphasized his sharp features. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself like royalty, which technically he was. The northern courts answered to him just as the eastern courts answered to Lysander. Lysander, Dorian said, his voice smooth as silk, and this must be the famous Katherine Pierce, the human who's captured the vampire king's cold heart. Dorian. Lysander's voice was ice. You're trespassing in my territory, am I? The northern courts don't recognize your authority anymore. We've declared independence. Dorian's smile was cruel. Your obsession with this mortal has made you weak. The councils agree that new leadership is needed. Do they? Lysander didn't move, didn't take his eyes off Dorian. That's interesting, since I spoke with the southern and western courts yesterday. They're quite happy with current leadership. Dorian's smile faltered slightly. The northern courts are enough. We'll take the others eventually. You'll try. Lysander's eyes blazed crimson. But first, you've made a fatal mistake. You've entered my territory uninvited and threatened someone under my protection. By the old laws, that's grounds for execution. The old laws protect vampires, not humans. The old laws protect those I choose to protect. Lysander's voice dropped to a deadly purr. Or have you forgotten who wrote most of those laws? Dorian's expression hardened. Your time is over, Lysander. Step aside and accept your obsolescence with dignity. No, then you'll die protecting your pet human. Dorian gestured to his warriors. Kill them both. The 3 vampires moved with supernatural speed, but they'd underestimated 2 things. First, Lysander's age and power made him faster and stronger than any of them. Second, Vladislav and 6 of Lysander's best warriors had been waiting in the apartment above, and they came crashing through the ceiling at the first sign of violence. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Vampire warriors clashed in Katherine's small apartment, moving too fast for human eyes to track properly. Katherine had pressed herself against the far wall like Lysander had taught her, staying out of the way while tracking the flow of battle. Lysander fought with 6 centuries of experience and the cold fury of someone protecting what he loved. He tore through Dorian's warriors with brutal efficiency, his movements precise and lethal. Within minutes, 2 of the 3 lay dead, their bodies already turning to ash. The 3rd warrior tried to grab Katherine, thinking he could use her as a hostage. It was the last mistake he ever made. Lysander moved faster than thought, appearing between Katherine and her attacker. His hand punched through the vampire's chest and ripped out his heart before the warrior could even register the threat. Mine! Lysander snarled as the body fell. She's mine, and anyone who touches her dies. Dorian stood alone now, his warriors dead or fled, facing down the vampire king in his full fury. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. This isn't over, Dorian said, backing toward the shattered door. The northern courts will bend the knee or burn, Lysander interrupted. He advanced on Dorian, his movements predatory. You wanted to test my strength? You wanted to see if loving a human made me weak? Look around, Dorian. Your warriors are dead. Your plan has failed. And now you're going to die for threatening what's mine. Wait, Dorian started, but Lysander was done waiting. The fight between 2 vampire lords was apocalyptic in scope. They crashed through walls and shattered furniture, moving with speed and power that would have seemed like magic to human eyes. Katherine watched from her safe corner, her heart in her throat, trusting Lysander to win but terrified all the same. In the end, experience and motivation won over ambition. Lysander got his hand around Dorian's throat and slammed the other vampire against the cracked wall hard enough to leave an impact crater. You lose, Lysander said quietly, and now the northern courts lose their lord. I hope whoever replaces you has better judgment. He ripped Dorian's head from his shoulders with one clean motion. The body crumbled to ash, and Lysander let it fall. The apartment was destroyed. Walls had holes in them, the furniture was splinters, and there were scorch marks everywhere from where vampire bodies had turned to ash. Vladislav stood in the center of it all, surrounded by Lysander's warriors, all of them bloodied but victorious. The northern courts? Lysander asked. 2 of Dorian's lieutenants are outside, Vladislav reported. They've asked for terms of surrender. Apparently, they weren't as committed to the coup as Dorian thought. I'll deal with them in a moment. Lysander turned to Katherine, who was still pressed against the wall, her eyes wide. Are you hurt? No, I'm fine. Katherine pushed off the wall and crossed to him on shaking legs. You're bleeding. It'll heal. Lysander pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. I'm sorry about your apartment. Are you kidding? That was the most terrifying and amazing thing I've ever seen. Katherine was trembling but smiling. You were incredible. I was motivated. Lysander kissed her forehead. Anyone who threatens you dies. That's a promise. I believe you. Katherine pulled back enough to look at him. What happens now? Now we rebuild. Lysander looked around at the destruction, and we make some changes to how things are done. Over the next week, Lysander restructured the vampire courts. The northern courts bent the knee and accepted his leadership after he installed one of Dorian's more reasonable lieutenants as temporary lord. He also pushed through changes to the old laws, expanding the protections to include humans under vampire protection, and adding severe penalties for anyone who used mortals as leverage in vampire politics. Katherine moved into Lysander's mansion while her apartment was being rebuilt. The other vampires in his court were wary of her at first, unsure how to treat a human who had their king's heart. But Katherine won them over gradually with her genuine interest in vampire history and her refusal to be intimidated by creatures that could kill her without effort. "She's good for you," Vladislav told Lysander one evening. They were standing on the mansion's balcony, watching the sunset and waiting for the night to fully claim the sky. "I haven't seen you this engaged with life in centuries. She makes me remember what it was like to be human," Lysander said quietly. "What it was like to hope and dream and believe good things were possible. Just be careful. She's still mortal, and mortals are fragile. I know." It was a truth Lysander thought about constantly. Katherine was aging in ways he couldn't perceive day to day, but he knew that one day he'd wake up and she'd be old while he remained unchanged. The thought filled him with dread and desperate longing. Katherine found him there an hour later, after the sun had fully set and the stars were beginning to emerge. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The future, and how little of it we have together." Katherine was quiet for a moment. Then she moved around to face him, taking his cold hands in her warm ones. "Lysander, I need to tell you something." "What?" "I've been doing research, talking to some of the older vampires in your court about turning and transformation." Katherine's eyes were steady and sure. "I want you to turn me." Lysander's whole body went rigid. "No, absolutely not. We've discussed this. We discussed it when I'd known you for a month. It's been 6 months now, and I'm more sure than ever." Katherine's voice was calm but firm. "I love you, and I want forever with you. The kind of forever that only immortality can provide. I told you about Sebastian. About what happened when I turned someone. Sebastian was dying and traumatized when you turned him. I'm healthy and clear-headed and making this choice willingly." Katherine squeezed his hands. "I'm not asking you to turn me today or even this year. But eventually, when I'm ready, I want you to do it. I want to spend eternity by your side." "Katherine, you don't understand what you're asking. Being a vampire means watching everyone you've ever known die. It means being cold and needing blood to survive. It means being with you," Katherine interrupted. "That's all that matters. Everything else we'll figure out together." Lysander wanted to refuse, wanted to tell her it was impossible and dangerous, and something he'd never do. But looking into Katherine's determined eyes, he remembered his own fear from months ago. The fear of her aging and dying while he remained unchanged. The fear of losing her to time and mortality. "If I do this," he said slowly, "we do it right. You'll finish your teaching certification first. You'll say goodbye to your friends properly, make arrangements so they won't look for you, and we'll wait until you're absolutely certain this is what you want. I'm certain now. Then you'll still be certain in a year." Lysander cupped her face gently. "I'm not turning you until I'm sure you understand everything you're giving up. I'm not giving anything up. I'm gaining forever with the person I love." Katherine smiled. "But fine, we'll wait a year. I can be patient." They spent the next year building a life together. Katherine finished her teaching certification and got a job at an underfunded elementary school, teaching children who needed someone to believe in them. She thrived in the work, coming home every evening with stories about her students that made Lysander's ancient heart ache with fondness. During the day, while Lysander slept, Katherine built friendships with the other vampires in the court. She learned vampire history and politics, studied the old languages, and slowly transformed from a frightened human who'd accidentally captured a king's attention into someone who could stand beside him as an equal. At night, she and Lysander explored the city together. He showed her the hidden vampire courts beneath the streets, the ancient gathering places and secret societies that existed in the shadows. She showed him the coffee shops and bookstores she loved, the small human spaces where magic existed in different forms. They celebrated human holidays and vampire festivals, blending their worlds in ways that made sense only to them. Lysander taught Katherine to fight properly, training her until she could hold her own against younger vampires. Katherine taught Lysander to relax, to find joy in small moments and quiet evenings. The Council of Vampire Lords accepted Katherine gradually, recognizing that their king was stronger and more focused with her by his side. Some vampires from other courts grumbled about a human having such influence, but after what had happened to Dorian, no one was foolish enough to challenge Lysander's choices openly. "You've changed the courts," Vladislav told Lysander one evening. "Half the lords have human companions now. You've made it acceptable to care about mortals instead of just using them." "Good," Lysander said. "We've spent too long pretending we're not capable of love or connection. It's made us cruel." Some would say cruelty is part of being a vampire. Then I'm changing what it means to be a vampire. As the year drew to a close, Lysander found himself both dreading and anticipating what came next. Katherine had proven her commitment, had demonstrated that she understood what immortality meant. She'd lived among vampires long enough to see both the beauty and the horror of their existence, and she still wanted to join them, still wanted to join him. On the anniversary of the night they'd officially met. The night Katherine had admitted she knew he'd been watching her, Lysander took her to a private chamber in the depths of the mansion. It was a room he'd prepared specifically for this moment, lined with soft fabrics and filled with the things Katherine loved: books and music, comfortable furniture, and warm lighting. "Are you sure?" he asked one final time. "Once I do this, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything." Katherine was wearing a simple dress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked beautiful and brave and slightly terrified, but her voice was steady. "I want forever with you, Lysander. Turn me." So he did. The transformation was agony. Lysander held Katherine through it, feeding her his ancient blood and staying by her side as the vampire venom worked through her system. She screamed and shook, her body dying and remaking itself into something new. It took 3 days, and every moment of Katherine's pain was torture for Lysander. But finally, on the 3rd night, Katherine's eyes opened. They were the same dark color they'd always been, but now they glowed with the faint crimson light of all vampires. Her skin had paled to white, and her dark hair seemed to shine with new luster. She was still Katherine, but transformed, immortal, perfect. "How do you feel?" Lysander asked, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine sat up slowly, testing her new body. "Strong, fast, hungry." She looked at her hands, turning them over and marveling at her pale skin. "Is this what it's like for you? Everything so bright and clear?" "Yes!" Lysander pulled her into his arms, relief flooding through him. "You survived! You're here! Did you doubt I would?" "Every moment of the past 3 days." Katherine laughed, and the sound was musical and bright. "I told you I was certain. Now we have forever." She pulled back to look at him, her new vampire eyes meeting his. "What do we do first? First, I teach you to hunt properly. Then we rebuild the court system to include turned humans as full members. And after that," Lysander smiled. And it was full of love and hope and the kind of joy he hadn't felt in 600 years. "After that, we live. We have eternity now. We can do anything." Katherine kissed him, and it was different now that she was vampire. She was stronger, more confident, able to meet him as an equal instead of a fragile human he needed to protect. The kiss deepened, and Lysander felt the weight of centuries of loneliness finally lift from his shoulders. He'd found his mate, his queen, his forever. 5 years later, Katherine stood beside Lysander as he addressed the assembled vampire courts. They'd called a grand council, bringing together lords and ladies from across the world to discuss the future of their kind. Katherine was dressed in formal court attire now, her white hair hanging in an elegant style that marked her as vampire royalty. She'd taken to immortality better than anyone could have predicted, her natural warmth and compassion transforming into fierce protection for those under her care. Together, she and Lysander had revolutionized vampire society. They'd established protections for humans in vampire territories, created paths for willing humans to join vampire courts, and pushed through laws that prioritized cooperation over domination. Not everyone agreed with their changes, but after what had happened to Dorian, few were willing to challenge the vampire king and his queen openly. "We stand at a crossroads," Lysander was saying to the assembled lords. "We can continue hiding in shadows, pretending humans are nothing but food and potential threats. Or we can evolve. We can build a future where vampires and humans coexist peacefully, where our kind doesn't have to choose between isolation and extinction." "Some will say we're betraying what we are," Katherine added, her voice carrying through the great hall. "But I say we're becoming what we should have been all along. Not monsters, but guardians. Not predators, but protectors." The speech was met with mixed reactions, but more vampires were nodding in agreement than Lysander had expected. Change was slow in a society that measured time in centuries, but it was happening. Their courts were thriving, their people were happier, and for the first time in millennia, vampires were discussing futures that extended beyond simple survival. After the council adjourned, Lysander and Katherine retired to their private chambers. It was a suite of rooms at the top of the mansion, decorated with treasures from across the centuries and filled with the warmth that Katherine had brought to Lysander's cold existence. "Do you ever regret it?" Lysander asked. They were standing on their balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. "Giving up your mortality?" "Never," Katherine said without hesitation. She took his hand, interlacing their pale fingers. I gave up decades for eternity. I gave up loneliness for partnership. How could I regret that? Some vampires never adjust. They spend eternity mourning what they lost. Then they're focusing on the wrong things. Katherine turned to face him fully. I didn't lose anything that mattered. I gained everything I ever wanted. Lysander pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I love you. I love you too. Katherine smiled, and it was the same fearless smile she'd worn that first night when she'd admitted to knowing he'd been watching her. Besides, someone needs to keep the Vampire King from becoming too serious and brooding. I'm not brooding. You're always brooding. It's part of your charm. Katherine pulled him toward their bedroom. Now come on. Eternity is waiting, and we have forever to spend together. As Lysander followed his wife into their chambers, he thought about the boy he'd been 600 years ago. That boy had lost everything: his family, his humanity, his innocence. He'd become a king through blood and strategy, had built an empire on the bones of his enemies, but that boy had also never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, he might find peace. And now, holding Katherine's hand and facing an eternity together, Lysander finally had. He'd found home in a cramped apartment listening to a lullaby. He'd found love with a woman brave enough to invite a vampire into her life. He'd found purpose in building a better world for both his kind and hers. The lonely boy who'd mourned his mother for centuries was finally at peace. And the Vampire King had found something more valuable than any throne or territory. He'd found someone to share forever with, and that made all the difference. In the years that followed, their legend grew. The Vampire King and his human-turned queen who revolutionized vampire society, who proved that love could bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, that change was possible even in a world governed by ancient tradition. They built schools for vampire children and established sanctuaries for humans who wanted to live alongside supernatural beings. They mediated disputes and prevented wars, their combined strength and wisdom making them respected across all vampire territories. But their greatest achievement wasn't political or social. It was personal. Every night, before they slept, Katherine would sing the old lullaby that had brought them together. The one Lysander's mother had sung centuries ago, the one that had drawn him to Katherine's window on that first fateful night. And every night, Lysander would hold his wife close and remember that even monsters could find redemption. Even the lost could find home. Even hearts that had been cold for centuries could learn to beat again. They had eternity now, together, and they would spend every moment of it building the kind of forever that dreams were made of. The vampire boy who'd crept into her room nightly just to hear the lullaby his mother once sang had found something better than memory or nostalgia. He'd found love, partnership, and a future worth fighting for. And in the end, that was the greatest magic of all.